Good morning, AP Econ students. Mr. Merle here, and in today's lesson, we're going to start to talk about supply and demand, the two factors that in some markets, not all markets, determine the price of a good or service. In our last video, we talked about how people make choices with their limited resources on what to buy, on how to get the most consumer satisfaction, the most bang for their buck. And when you know that people think like that, now we can start talking about why the price of things are the way they are. So this video is talking about demand, and the next video is going to be talking about supply. Hope you're excited. I'm excited. Let's get started. Okay, let's talk about a couple of different terms when we're talking about markets. Again, a market is a place where buyers and sellers come together. And there are a lot of types of economies, but a market economy are when you have little to no government interference when households and firms, people and businesses, are exchanging goods and services, paying for different goods or services. So in a market economy, the government isn't trying to regulate things. It isn't putting in price floors or price ceilings. It isn't trying to influence what can be bought or how much of a particular type of good is in a market. Now, in this particular type of economy, the most successful firms create the things that households want. The households respond to that. They buy those things that those firms are creating. And it's guided by something called the invisible hand. The invisible hand basically says, hey, if you're a business that isn't doing things its customers want, if you aren't appealing to buyers, if you aren't making a product that buyers want, they're not going to go to you and you're going to go out of business. It's the invisible hand. If you raise prices too high, people won't want it and the price will come back down. If your price is low and a lot of people want it, you'll raise it to meet that demand. And this is when prices are determined by supply, how much of a good or service there is, and demand. And that's how supply and demand functions in this type of market. A couple other different terms we need to know for markets. First, a competitive market. And in a competitive market, that's where an individual buyer or seller doesn't have too much influence on the price of a good in a market economy. So for instance, when I lived in Kuwait, we had souks. And you would have all the different companies that sold a particular good all in one place. So I would often go to the fabric souk, and there would be 150 different fabric stores selling fabric. You know, if you have one more fabric store come in, it's not going to influence the price of the fabric. And if you have a few more people come in, it's not going to influence the price. But in an imperfect market, you have one buyer or one seller can greatly influence it. So let's think of it this way. Let's say you're in a little small town, and there is one restaurant in that town. And everyone goes to that restaurant. The nearest town is 100 kilometers away. And let's say this particular restaurant sells steaks. Well, what if another steakhouse is built next door? Well, then suddenly that original restaurant has to alter its prices to compete with that other store. Or let's say there's that one store and suddenly there's a population boom in the town. Everyone wants to go into that restaurant. You can now raise your prices because you have more people there. That's an imperfect market. Market power is a business's or a firm's ability to influence the price or good by having control over its demand, its supply, or both. So let's talk about De Beers. It's a company that owns most of the diamond market. And it can control the price of diamonds based on how much it releases. It controls a lot of the supply of diamonds. Whereas a monopoly is when a single company controls the entire market for a particular good. It would be as if Apple owned all computer chips. Like they had the components that could build iPhones. No one else could. They could charge whatever they wanted in that case. That's how markets work. Now, let's talk about a little bit about demand. Demand, if we're looking for a technical term, is the different quantities of goods that consumers are willing and able to buy at different prices. So, you may have a lot of money. You might be able to buy a Ferrari, but you might not be willing to. You might not be able to buy that new phone, but you might not be willing to. You might be able to buy a Big Mac, but you're not willing to. Demand is what you are willing to buy and you are able to buy. Now, there's a law for demand, and it's called the law of demand. I can't believe I just said that twice. Yeah, I'm not perfect on these takes. And the law of demand says there's an inverse, which means when one goes up, one goes down, relationship between the price and the quantity demanded, which makes sense. If the price of something starts going up, your willingness or ability to purchase it is going to go down. You might be able to buy that car for 20,000 JD or 20,000 euros, but when it gets raised to 30,000, the demand's not going to be as high. Now, one term you need to know here is quantity demanded, which is the amount of a good or service that buyers are willing and able to purchase at that current price. This is different than a change in demand. So a quantity demanded is how much you're willing to buy at particular prices. Now, I say that's different than a change in demand because that shifts graphs completely. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So quantity demanded is just how much you want at particular prices. Two other terms you need to know before we start looking at some of this data. A demand schedule looks kind of like this. It's just a relationship between the price of a good and how much of the demand there is for that good. And a demand curve is just a graph that shows this relationship. So let's start talking about an example here. So let's use an example of salmon. Want some fish. And we have three people here. We have Melissa, we have Ryan, and we have something called combined market demand, or just market demand. Now notice, because demand is what you are willing and able to buy, what Melissa might demand for the different price of salmon is not what Ryan's demand would be. Ryan can buy it at $17.50, Melissa can't. So this is the demand schedule. Notice that their demand is different, and if we combine them together, we would get market demand. So it's all the people who are willing to participate in buying that product. You put all their demand schedules together, that's combined market demand. So if we looked at the curve for this, here's Melissa's. So here's the price on the y-axis and the quantity she would demand on the x-axis. And here's the price for Ryan and the demand for Ryan. And if you combine both of them together, this is what the combined market demand would be. Simple. Okay. So that is what those particular things look like. Now, if we're talking a little bit more about market demand, again, it's the sum of everything. Let's also talk about the demand curve because, again, the quantity demanded is basically how much you're able to buy salmon at different prices. But the demand curve is when the entire line shifts and it starts moving over here, or maybe it goes back down here. So let's talk about what will entirely shift the demand curve itself. Because it's a representation of the demand schedule, and again, it's downward sloping, inverse of the price. I don't need to read these points. You are intelligent AP students. But one thing to know is when you're looking at these things, and again, this isn't perfectly considering how life works, but when you're reading these, you have to assume all outside factors like income are held constant, so that it's not changing. And we just use that data because if you start considering that people's income changes on a day-to-day or a week-to-week basis, you can't graph anything. So, just as a little reminder how we got market demand, you take everyone's individual demand, you add it all together, and you get the market for that good. We just talked about that. So how does this demand curve shift? It will shift because of purchasing power. The law of demand occurs because of purchasing power, because of how much money you have. You have more money, you can have higher demand. Or if the price for something goes down, you'll have higher demand for that good. Now, purchasing power, the term is the value of your income expressed in terms of how much you can afford. And based on your purchasing power, the entire curve of a demand curve will shift. Sometimes when consumers get more money, their income goes up, they'll buy more what we call normal goods. These are things more like luxury items, vacations, jewelry, cars. But when income goes down, and that's supposed to say down, I'm sorry. When income goes down, people will start buying inferior goods. So the demand curve will shift to the right for inferior goods. That's things like ramen noodles. If you're a college student and you're poor, well, you're not going to be buying steak and lobster. A couple of other things that will shift the demand curve is compliments. So let's say that there's a new study that comes out that says peanut butter will increase your lifespan by 10 years. Well, because peanut butter and jelly are complements, they're often put together when you go to grocery stores, the demand for one will shift the demand curve for the other. Whereas substitutes, let's say that, again, I use this example a lot, what if the price for an iPhone goes up and the price for a Samsung Galaxy goes down? Well, because they're technically the same good, the demand for the Galaxy is going to go up because the price of an Apple iPhone is going up. There are a couple of other things that will shift demand curves, changes in taste or fashion. I mean, people just change their minds about what they like, what they think is going to happen in the future. You know, people get it on in Bitcoin now because it's going to go up. The number of buyers, taxes if the government intervenes. But one thing I want you to know is the change in price will not shift the curve. That will just shift the curve demand, the demand quantity itself along the existing curve. But if you want to shift it to the right or to the left as a whole, it has to be something beyond just price. So let's look at some of those things. This is a little bit of a recap. You can read that. And this is when it shifts to the left, which means demand decreases entirely along any quantity or price. And here are the things that shifted to the right. So just pause the video really quick. This is a real summary of the things that I just mentioned, but just note that. Lastly, again, here's how this will work. Here's our original demand curve for, let's say, cereal, right? The price of cereal is up here. The quantity of cereal demand is down here. And if we want to change it to the second curve, we have to have some of those factors come into play. Cereal will increase your lifespan, or milk has gone down in price, and so that changes the demand there. Okay, so that's how demand works. And in class, we're going to be going through some of these scenarios, and you're going to be predicting how things will shift the change in demand. In our next video, we're going to be talking about supply, and we're going to see how when supply and demand come together, that's where the price of a good or service gets determined. Well, hope you learned something you didn't know before. Thanks for watching.